Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.
Hi, welcome back to Bible Answers. I am your host, Dr. Al Garza. So, what I want to discuss today in today's topic is regarding my Hebrew Matthew book project that I've been working on for the last few months. Now, for the last few years, I've been working on just bringing an introduction to some Hebrew New Testament texts that have been discovered. They're being worked on right now and translated. They're already cataloged online at different universities and at different museums, from the British Museum to Oxford to the Jewish Theological Seminary to Hebrew University to the Vatican Archives. So there are New Testament Hebrew documents out there, and what I decided to do is write an introduction to some of these Hebrew New Testament texts. Some of the variants within them, some of them what they contain in them that's different from the Greek, how we could know for sure if they're not a translation from Greek or Latin or another text, and if they can be shown to go back to an earlier Hebrew source text, as far as we can get back to. Things that are in there. So I did put a book together, and it did come out a little over a week ago, and here's a copy of it, a hard copy of it. As you can see, this is the New Testament Hebrew Evidence and Issues. And in this book, there are photographs of some of the Hebrew New Testament texts, some of the ones that I've been working on, some of the ones that other people are working on, and there are others and a lot more. They have found pretty much the whole New Testament in Hebrew in different sections and parts. And they're working on right now a translation of them and working to see their authenticity. Now, we do know that some are a translation from, let's say, an Indo-European language like maybe Latin or Greek or something, but there are others, and some that I put in my book, that demonstrate based on what they contain that they are not from a translation from another language. And even some of them that are considered translation from another language, they contain some very interesting things in there. So what I want to tell you first is what these Hebrew New Testament texts, what they are not. And then I'll talk about what they are. And I am working on right now, going through Hebrew Matthew. And I'm working on just dividing them in their chapter and verses of how we know them in our Bible. And then I'm going to go back and of course, do an English translation and bring out some of the variants within the differences between the Hebrew and the Greek texts that we have, as well as some other Hebrew Matthew text variants, textual variants, some other textual variants between the number of different texts we have. And then show and point that, obviously that they cannot be a translation from another language like Greek or Latin or so forth, that these do point to an earlier Hebrew source. And I do point out some of these examples. So what we are not saying as scholars in the field and examining texts, and I'm not the only one doing this, but what we are not saying is that these are original Hebrew texts, that these are originals. There are no originals. But we do have copies of copies of copies. And some of them, like the Greek and Latin, are a translation from another language, or translation to a copy, to a copy, to a copy, and so on. So what these are not originals. No one's claiming these originals of anything, but they are a copy from another Hebrew text, obviously being preserved. We look at these texts like we look at any other text out there, any other manuscript we find, whether it's a Greek manuscript, a Syriac manuscript, a Latin manuscript, whatever manuscript we have, we always look and examine them and see what they contain, because sometimes they help fill in the gaps of other texts, whether you believe the Greek is the original, or the Greek language is the original written New Testament, or you believe that there are also Hebrew texts written during the first century and then copied into other languages, as some of the early church fathers say. But my book is based on the evidence, okay, not my speculation or assumption. This is the evidence that you can look at, decide for yourself, make your own decisions, draw your own conclusions. That's what my book is. It's an introduction. It's not an exhaustive work. It's an introduction, a little less than 200 pages, but it's an introduction with photographs of what's in some of these Hebrew texts, and how we could know if they go back to an earlier Hebrew source, or if they are a copy or taken from maybe another language like Greek or Latin and so forth. But I demonstrate some clear examples and clear evidence that do point to an earlier Hebrew source. Now, some of the Hebrew texts in here are not, they're at different museums or different. They were pulled from different archives from different places, so they're not. It's not Hebrew text like we know in our Bible, all brought together and we're going through. And these are independent individual witnesses that have something to say. So whether you believe in an original Greek, a written language, or a Hebrew and Greek, or just a Hebrew translated into Greek and so forth, I believe this will help tremendously in textual studies. And when I'm done working on my Matthew with the Hebrew Matthew, that's going to be more of an exhaustive work. I should have it done by the end of next year, hopefully around the same time next year or by the end of 2021. That's my goal, because I'm really looking through these Hebrew texts and I'm looking at a number of variants. I'm looking at the Greek text we have, seeing what's in there. There's some interesting things, things that you can't find in Greek that are demonstrated in this Hebrew. Now, the Hebrew text that I'm working on does have the vowel points underneath the letters, because that helps to identify the oral tradition behind the Hebrew words and verses that are being used there, because sometimes Hebrew has a word that's spelled exactly. You could have a Hebrew word spelled the same and have two different meanings, and that's common Hebrew. The only way you can make a distinction of what word it is either if you know Hebrew and can read the context, or the vowel pointing that's put underneath that tells you what word it's referring to, and that's given by oral tradition. So the Hebrew that I'm looking at right now has those vowel pointings, those markings, and that makes a big difference, because now I can see how the scribe who was writing it, the rabbi or the Jew who was writing it, how he understood from oral tradition what the text was saying originally, as far as what he was copying and what was handed down. And that's important, because let me give you an example. This is this could be considered to a lot of people a huge deal in interpreting text. We have the word Lord, of course, in Greek, kurios, the root word kurios, which means master, or it could mean just Lord. It doesn't represent God's name in any way, or the Hebrew expression of Adonai, which represents God, or Adoni, my Lord, or Adon, or even the divine name Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. So how do you know the word kurios is referring to one of those? Well, we don't. We have to just speculate, or just kind of draw our conclusions from the text. But in the Hebrew Gospels, specifically in Matthew I'm working on, with the vowel points, it has Adonai or Adoni, or it has, the actual Tetragrammaton in there, Yod He Vav He, and it's a shortened form. So these texts will tell you when Jesus is called Lord in the Greek, you have, kurios. It might be kori, it might be a different word, but the root word is kurios, master. Well, what's interesting is that in some of these places in the Hebrew Matthew where Jesus talks about anyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, or those who call on me, he says, Lord, Lord, it's the Hebrew Adonai in the Hebrew text. Now, Adonai, like I said, is the substitute name of God. So when the Jews don't want to say the name, Yod He Vav He, they don't want to pronounce it, they'll say Hashem, or they'll say Adonai. And only God himself is called Adonai. If you want to refer to a king or an individual, you would say Adoni or Adon. But these Hebrew Matthew texts, by oral tradition and the vowel pointing, point to Adonai, that Jesus was called Adonai, by the divine name, substitute of the divine name. We also have in the Hebrew James, the introduction of Jesus being called Adonai. Not Adoni, not Adon, but Adonai. Now, that's key, because this confirms early, tradition of Jesus being God. Something that's been in controversy in the Hebrew text points to, the disciples calling him Adonai. Jesus himself refers himself as Adonai. The centurion who approached him to heal his servant called him Adonai, or used that expression to show that he was divine. There are many texts like that. There are many, Hebrew phrases for Adonai in there that are not used, that are used for Jesus in the sense of being God. And so that's key. There are other things in there that bring out the virgin birth controversy, which I've talked about in other videos, the genealogy. It goes back the virgin birth, how it's explained compared to the Hebrew scriptures and comparison to the Hebrew Matthew. There's just quite a bit in there that I'm working through, and it's taking me a while because I'm taking notes and I'm writing down where I want to go back and kind of do a little deeper study on once I'm done dividing the chapters and verses. Then I want to go back and start looking at the textual variants and so forth. But my book goes in a great deal with that, specifically the divine name. The divine name, not just Adonai, but the Yod He Vav He, used in the Hebrew can be shortened to two yods. Yod in Hebrew, two Y's we would say in English. But I lay the case out through other scholars' work about how the vowel pointing that was discovered in Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts by Nehemiah Gordon, those 2,000 plus Hebrew manuscripts that say that the name is Yehovah with the full vowels, that's a witness in those ancient Hebrew Old Testament texts that he has. Over 2,000 Hebrew Old Testament texts that contain the full vowels. Then we have Jewish tradition in rabbinic sources that say the vowels are Shiva Holam Kamatz, which represents the name Yehovah. So we have over a dozen rabbinic sources that say the same thing that he found in the Hebrew text. Then we have the New Testament Hebrew manuscripts with the vowel pointings that show up in the Vatican archives, Hebrew University archives, and the texts that I'm looking at that come from the British Library as well as in Oxford and so forth, that contain the name of God with the full vowels. Now in the Hebrew Matthew that I'm working on, it uses the two yods, the yod, to represent the name of God, but it has all three vowels, the Shiva Holam Kamatz vowel pointings in there, which confirms what's in the Hebrew within the rabbinic sources and with the other New Testament texts that the name is Yehovah. This is only done by Jewish tradition passed down orally from the time of Jesus that the name was known to this time. And they're in this Hebrew Matthew, which is amazing. All the vowel pointing that has been in controversy is actually in this Hebrew Matthew with all three vowel points. And I put it in this book so you can see it for yourself. As well as James and Jude's Hebrew has Yod He Vav He with all the vowels. And the Hebrew Jude and the Hebrew Matthew, the Hebrew Jude and the Hebrew James contain all the letters Yod He Vav He with all the vowels, Shiva Holam Kamatz. And that that's evidence that this is coming from a Jewish source, because there are no Western scholarly sources that represent Yehovah. It's always Yahweh. Or Jehovah or other names, but never Yehovah. That's only found in rabbinic tradition, which again, I lay out in my book, the evidence and why they're in these Hebrew New Testament texts, which is interesting because even the Talmud itself, which goes back to, they're being written after Jesus, of course, the fourth, 5th century being composited, but based on oral tradition, even the Talmud states that there were gospels during the time of Jesus by the heretics, they called them, that contained the name of God in Hebrew. That's what this Hebrew Matthew I'm looking at has. That's what the other Hebrew texts of John and Luke and James and Jude, they contain the name of God with the full vowels, just like the Talmud states, which dates it back to the oral tradition of the 1st century, as well as the Jews putting together the Talmud, the 4th, 5th century on, just like I have it here. So those are the things that we need to consider. The oral tradition handed down, the Talmud confirms it in the rabbinic tradition. They're contained in these Hebrew texts. So these are things that we're looking at, things that I'm looking at. Now again, I'm doing this as an independent research scholar, which I'll be submitting my work later to another university to take a look at. But in this book, this is just an introduction. It's not exhaustive, but I give clear photos of these Hebrew New Testament texts. I have them circled because if you can't read Hebrew, I circled the words. I go into the traditions of the text, a little bit of the name of God, where they're found. You can see pictures. Yes, there's Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, but there's also the other Hebrew manuscripts that were found. Other than the 9 that Shem Tov used, there's also up to 26 or so Hebrew Matthews, the ones I'm looking at. There's a revelation in Hebrew with the full name, the full vowels with the name Yod He Vav He. These are things that do not come from a Greek or Latin text. Jesus was called Adonai. not kurios, which is a generic Greek term, but Adonai, the substitute name of God. Jesus is called that in these gospel texts. So I point that out with other things in there, and I will be getting into more of this when I'm finished doing my translation and textual variants and more of a really heavy work on that. It's probably going to be close to 300 pages or more. But I'll be available hopefully by the end of next year if I continue to get this stuff done. But listen, if you want an introduction to it, this is the book. There's paperback and hard copy. There's black and white or color photos versions. Of course, the color versions is more expensive. You can get the paperback black and white version if you're not interested in it for a lesser price. There's the color photos of the text and on Amazon as well. You can get the hard copy at my website, drlgarza.org, or it there, and I can have it sent out to you. But these are things that need to be taken seriously. Here's the problem I have. People who have not even looked at these texts, even done any kind of serious study or even looked at them to do research, simply dismiss them because they already believe in a biased way that the New Testament was originally written in Greek and that's it. So anything else is not worth looking at. Talk about Hebrew text, it's all fake, blah, blah. These are people who really have no, they have no clue of what they're talking about. Until they've actually analyzed the text, done a textual study of the text, looked at it, and seeing what's in it. Yes, we know they're dated between 13th, 14th century up until the 17th, 18th century. Yes, we know that. But it's what they contain. The things that we say, can they point back to an earlier Hebrew tradition? And yes, they can. Jerome talks about variants of with Barabbas and the Greek, which in Hebrew be Bar Abba, son of the father. Jerome says that the Hebrew gospel text that he was looking at, comparison has son of the teacher, Bar Rabbon. Guess what? In my book, I show pictures of Bar Rabbon, the Hebrew Matthew, that has that variant that's spoken by Jerome, that dates back to the 4th century Jerome. So that means it's got to predate him. And also there's a Hebrew text that says Bar Rabbah, which is son of the great one, which again goes back to the teacher, son of the teacher, son of the great one, the one who is not son of the father. So these texts point to Jerome's variants as well. In other places, I point to a few places with Jerome that point to the 4th century Jerome and before through tradition. So this can't be just dismissed because people want to believe in just a Greek only superiority. These are coming out whether people like it or not, and they're going to have to be dealt with in a serious way. So yes, I'm taking a look at it now. I'm doing some work on it now because I want to be on the front lines and get this stuff out there to people to introduce it to them because this is a serious study. So again, this book is an introduction. It's not exhaustive, but it gives you some photos. It gives you some brief examples of these things and some background of what to expect and what's coming. So that's kind of an update of where I'm at. This book is available. My Hebrew Matthew will be available hopefully by the end of next year, and that'll be more of an exhaustive study. But if you have questions or comments, leave them here. I try to respond to everybody, and I try to do it fairly. If you're just going to make a comment and make a snide remark, oh, it's all fake, blah, 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 please don't leave a remark. All you're showing is your ignorance when you just want to criticize somebody without even knowing what you're talking about or even have seen this or even done any study. It's just childish to me. So unless you want to have a serious conversation, then leave a comment. You can like and share. Email me. Talk about more about the book if you want more information. But don't just leave comments that that shows your ignorance on what you don't know and what you have not seen. I'm looking at this and I see a lot of things in here that point to an earlier Hebrew source. The Greek might have in one passage example the demons calling out Jesus and saying, "Who are you here to torment us at this time, Son of God?" And all the Greek texts have that, but in the Hebrew it says it refers to Jesus, the Son of God, puts his name Yeshua, Ben Ha-Elohim. So it actually puts the name Jesus. So there's little nuances in there that deviate from the Greek of whatever the Jew was, or the rabbi was writing actually had the name Yeshua in that text. So it's not coming from a Greek text. So it's coming from a Hebrew text that might have a tradition where it says Yeshua, Son of God, or Yeshua, the Son of God. There are things in there like that, besides the Adonai, that show that this is not coming from a Greek translation. So again, look at it for yourself, make your own decision based on the evidence, but don't make comments or dismiss anything if you haven't seen it, because that just shows complete ignorance and lack of any kind of real seriousness to study. So let's take it seriously. Let's look and see what we got here. But again, I am working on this. I'll keep updating you when I get a chance, more things that I'm finding. But again, if you have any questions, comments, please leave them here. But please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't done so. And I'll try and answer all your questions, or just shoot me an email, go to my website, and look at them there. So I want to say thank you for listening. Be safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon. God bless.
Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.